I've been on missions that defied reason, ones that left scars on my body and marks on my mind. But nothing, no war zone, no covert op, no shadowy corridor of politics prepared me for this, the dead zone. Even saying its name aloud felt like an invocation, summoning something best left in the dark. I wish I'd never stepped into that room, never seen the faces of men who knew too much and said too little. I wish I'd never read the rules. The briefing took place in one of those rooms the military loves. Low ceilings, fluorescent lighting, no windows. The kind of place where you'd think the air itself was classified. The commander was already there when we filed in, standing at the head of a long steel table. He didn't look up, just gestured for us to sit. There were 6 of us, handpicked from across special operations for a mission so secret it barely had a name. I thought it'd be like any other high-clearance op. Drop in, secure the package, get out. But when the commander finally looked up, there was something in his face I didn't expect. Fear. "This mission will be unlike anything you've faced before," he said. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled as he passed out the dossiers. "You've been selected because you're the best, but in the dead zone, skill alone won't save you." I flipped open the file, scanning through pages of reports that didn't make sense. Recon Unit Alpha, lost. Aerial surveillance, interference. Terrain, uncharted. The deeper I read, the less it felt like a military op, and more like the setup for a ghost story. And then I found the rules. There were 10 of them, printed in bold at the top of the last page. No explanation, no context. Just cold, unrelenting directives. Rule 1, stay together at all costs. Never separate from your team. Those who stray belong to the forest now. Rule 2, do not acknowledge anyone you didn't arrive with. Their faces are masks, their voices are traps. Rule 3, never look directly at the lights if you see them. They will show you your greatest desire before they take it away forever. Rule 4, if you hear music, cover your ears and leave immediately. It is not a song, it is a snare. Rule 5, do not use electronic devices after 2200 hours. What calls you back will not be human. Rule 6, if someone in your team begins acting strangely, isolate them immediately. They are already gone, but they'll take you with them if you stay. Rule 7, burn any maps you find in the dead zone. These maps are paths to nowhere. Rule 8, if you find a survivor from the missing unit, ask them what day it is. If they answer incorrectly, leave them behind. They wear the skin of the living, but answer with the knowledge of the dead. Rule 9, do not sleep after midnight. In the dead zone, dreams belong to it, and so will you. Rule 10, if you hear a voice calling your name from the woods, ignore it. It knows who you love, and it will use them against you. I leaned back in my chair, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. Across the table, Harrison, the loudmouth of the group, snorted. "This for real?" he asked, holding the file up. "We're not kids sitting around a campfire. What's next? Don't feed the trolls under the bridge." The commander slammed his hand down on the table, and the sound echoed like a gunshot. "You will follow these rules." His voice was tight, his jaw set. "Do you understand me? This is not a joke. This is not superstition. You break them, you die. Or worse. Worse than dying," Harrison muttered. But he didn't say it loud enough to get another reprimand. I stared at the list again, trying to suppress the gnawing unease in my gut. Rules were supposed to make things clear. They gave you boundaries, structure, but these didn't clarify anything. They just added to the questions already clawing at my brain. "What exactly are we walking into?" I asked finally. The commander's shoulders sagged slightly, like he'd been waiting for someone to ask. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a photograph. It was grainy and blurred, like it had been taken through a thick pane of glass. But even in the distortion, I could see the outlines of something wrong. The figure was humanoid, but too tall, too thin, its limbs bending at impossible angles. Its face was featureless, save for 2 pinpricks of light where eyes should have been. "This," he said, setting the photo down, "is why the rules exist. Break one, and it will find you." The room fell silent. No one asked any more questions. By the time we were on the helicopter, the tension was palpable. No jokes, no idle chatter, just the steady thrum of the rotors and the occasional crackle of static in our headsets. The dead zone loomed ahead of us, a dense, dark forest that stretched beyond the horizon, its outline jagged against the night sky. I could feel it even before we landed, something old, something waiting. The rules sat in my pocket, folded neatly, like a prayer I didn't believe in but couldn't ignore. I told myself they were nonsense, superstition, something to scare us into staying sharp. But as the helicopter descended and the forest swallowed us whole, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were more than rules. They were warnings, and we were far too close to whatever they were meant to protect us from. The first thing I noticed when we landed was the silence. Not the kind of quiet you find in the wilderness, where crickets chirp and the wind rustles through leaves. This was absolute, the kind of silence that pressed into your ears and settled in your chest, leaving you straining to hear anything, even the sound of your own breath. "Spread out," Captain Daniels ordered, his voice cutting through the oppressive stillness. "Stay in formation, eyes sharp." I stepped off the helicopter, boots crunching on brittle leaves and dry twigs. The air felt wrong, cold, but not natural. It clung to my skin like something alive. My flashlight cut through the fog, illuminating dark, gnarled trees that stretched toward the sky like skeletal fingers. They grew too close together, their branches tangling overhead to blot out the moonlight. Shadows shifted at the edges of the beam, but when I turned my head, there was nothing there. Behind me, Harrison muttered, "Hell of a place for a camping trip." "No chatter," Daniels barked. The team moved as one, 6 soldiers in staggered formation. Daniels led, with me and Corporal Mills just behind. Harrison, Morales, and Vickers brought up the rear. We were loaded with enough gear to wage a small war, but as we moved deeper into the forest, it all felt useless. Guns, knives, grenades, what good were they against something you couldn't see? We'd been walking for 20 minutes when the first incident happened. It wasn't anything dramatic, just the faint crunch of leaves behind us. Subtle, easy to dismiss. But I knew every one of us heard it. The team froze, weapons up, scanning the trees. "Movement," Morales whispered, his voice barely audible. Daniels motioned for us to hold position while he turned, his flashlight sweeping the trees. I felt the grip of my rifle slick with sweat as I stared into the darkness, trying to convince myself the sound had been a deer or some other animal. But there was no movement now, no sound, just the unnatural stillness of the forest. "Clear," Daniel said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. We started moving again, this time slower. The air felt heavier, and the trees seemed to loom closer, as if the forest itself was closing in around us. That's when Harrison broke formation. We didn't notice at first. The fog had thickened, reducing visibility to just a few feet. I kept my eyes on Mills's back, trusting the rhythm of his steps to keep me on track. But then the line stopped, and I nearly ran into him. "Where's Harrison?" Daniels asked, his voice tight. I glanced back. There was a gap where Harrison should have been. My stomach sank. He'd been right behind me. I knew he had. "God damn it," Daniels muttered. "Morales, Vickers, double back. Find him." They moved quickly, disappearing into the fog. The rest of us waited, scanning the trees. My pulse hammered in my ears as the silence stretched, broken only by the faint sound of twigs snapping underfoot. Seconds turned into minutes. Finally, they returned, alone. "No sign of him," Morales said, his face pale. "We called out, but..." Daniels didn't let him finish. "He knows the rules. He should have stayed with the group. We move on." "What if he's hurt?" I asked before I could stop myself. Daniels shot me a glare. "He's not hurt," he said. "If he broke formation, he's already gone." We found Harrison 20 minutes later. At least we found what was left of him. The fog thinned as we approached a clearing, revealing a mess of scattered gear. His pack, his rifle, one boot lying on its side. But no Harrison. His helmet sat upright, perfectly centered on the ground, with his name stenciled across the front. It was clean. Too clean. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, just emptiness. I stepped closer, my flashlight flickering as it swept over the scene. That's when I saw it. His other boot, still upright, with the laces tied neatly. It was as if he'd stepped out of them and disappeared. "Stay together," Daniels snapped, his voice breaking the spell. "Eyes up. We move." Morales hesitated. "What about?" "We move," Daniels repeated, louder this time. He didn't wait for an argument. We left Harrison's gear behind, but the weight of his absence stayed with us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not by something human, but by the forest itself. The trees seemed closer now, their branches tangling overhead to form a suffocating canopy. Every step felt heavier, every shadow more menacing. As the fog thickened again, I fell into step beside Mills. "You think he's alive?" I asked quietly. Mills didn't look at me. His face was pale, his eyes fixed straight ahead. "I don't think we'll ever know." That was the moment it hit me. The rules weren't just guidelines, they were lifelines. And Harrison had broken the first one. We'd lost him because he'd strayed, and the forest had claimed him. I didn't know where he was now, or what he was, but I knew one thing for certain. He wasn't coming back. The air grew colder as we pushed further into the dead zone. Each breath felt heavier, like the forest was sapping the strength out of us, one step at a time. The oppressive silence pressed in, making even the smallest sound seem deafening. No one spoke, not since Harrison disappeared. It was as if his name had become a taboo, an unspoken reminder of what happens when you falter. Daniels led us through the fog with a grim determination, his flashlight sweeping the trees ahead. I stayed close behind, counting our footsteps like it was some kind of lifeline. Behind me, Morales and Vickers whispered to each other, their voices tense, but I couldn't make out the words. Mills walked on my right, silent and stiff, gripping his rifle so hard his knuckles were white. I tried to focus, to stay sharp, but the rules kept replaying in my head. "Stay together, Don't acknowledge anyone you didn't arrive with. Don't look at the lights. The words gnawed at me, their meanings twisting into something darker with every step. I didn't want to believe them, but Harrison was gone, and that made them real. The figure appeared an hour later. It happened fast, so fast I almost didn't process it. One moment, the path ahead was clear. The next, there was a man standing there. His uniform was torn and bloodied, but I recognized the insignia on his shoulder, Recon Unit Alpha. Jesus, Morales whispered behind me. It's one of them. Daniels raised a hand, signaling us to stop. The man didn't move. He just stood there, swaying slightly, his head tilted to one side like he was listening to something we couldn't hear. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, they didn't look right. They were too dark, like empty sockets that hadn't been filled. Don't engage, Daniel said, his voice low and firm. Follow the rules. But Vickers ignored him. Hey, he called out, stepping forward. You okay? Are you... The figure snapped its head toward us, and my stomach dropped. Its face twisted, the features contorting into something that wasn't human. Its mouth opened, far too wide, and a sound came out, a garbled, choking noise that didn't belong to any living thing. Before any of us could react, the figure collapsed. Not like a body hitting the ground, but like something falling apart. 1 second it was standing there, and the next it was a pile of ash, scattering in the faint breeze. What the hell was that? Vickers gasped, stumbling back. You just broke Rule 2, Daniel said, his voice cold. Congratulations. You might have just killed us all. Vickers opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. He looked down at the ash, then back at us, his face pale and his hands trembling. No one said anything. No one needed to. We kept moving, faster now. The tension was unbearable, every shadow and flicker of movement sending my heart racing. Vickers walked in the middle of the group, his head down, his shoulders hunched. He didn't say a word. The lights came an hour later. At first they were faint, little pinpricks in the distance that could have been anything. Fireflies, maybe, but they grew brighter, closer, until they were unmistakable. They floated through the trees like will-o'-the-wisps, casting a faint glow that made the shadows dance. Don't look at them, Daniels hissed. Keep your eyes on the ground. Move. It was easier said than done. The lights were mesmerizing, their glow pulsing softly like a heartbeat. I felt a strange pull, an urge to look, to see what they were. My feet faltered, and for a split second, my gaze drifted. No! Mills grabbed my arm, yanking me forward. Just don't. Behind us, I heard a gasp. I turned just in time to see Morales frozen in place, his eyes locked on one of the lights. His face was wet with tears, and his lips moved silently, like he was whispering to someone. Morales, Daniels whispered. Don't look. But it was too late. The light flared, brighter than the sun, and Morales screamed. It wasn't just fear. It was agony, raw and unrelenting. Then he was gone. Just gone. His rifle clattered to the ground and the light floated away, fading back into the trees as if nothing had happened. We didn't stop after that. No one spoke. No one looked back. We just kept moving, faster and faster, until my legs burned and my lungs ached. The silence was worse now, heavier, like the forest was punishing us for what had happened. Daniels finally called a halt when we reached a small clearing. He turned to us, his face pale and drawn. From this point on, you follow the rules. No exceptions, no mistakes. Do you understand me?" We nodded, too afraid to do anything else. But in the back of my mind, a single thought lingered, unspoken but impossible to ignore. What happens when we run out of rules to break? The clearing didn't offer any sense of safety. If anything, it felt worse. The open space was a mockery of freedom, surrounded on all sides by the same tangled trees and encroaching fog. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. And yet, Daniel stopped, signaling us to take a breather. 5 minutes, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. His hand rested on his rifle, his eyes scanning the tree line like he expected something, or someone, to step out. No one argued. We needed the break, even if the tension in the air felt like it might crush us. I dropped to one knee, rifle propped on my thigh, and took a deep breath. The cold air burned my lungs, but it was better than suffocating on the fear clawing at my chest. Vickers stood a few feet away, his back to us. He hadn't said a word since the figure turned to ash. His breathing was shallow, his shoulders rigid. I wanted to say something, but the words caught in my throat. What could I say? What could anyone say after what we'd seen? The silence dragged on, stretching into something unbearable. I glanced at Daniels, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but his face was pale and lined with something I hadn't seen in him before. Dread. Even he didn't know what to do. That's when Vickers spoke. "Do you hear that?" he said, his voice hoarse. I frowned, turning to him. "Hear what?" He didn't answer. His head tilted slightly, like he was listening to something just out of reach. The fog curled around his legs, thickening, and the faint glow of the lights reflected in his wide, unblinking eyes. "Vickers," Daniel snapped. "Stay with us. What do you hear?" For a moment, Vickers didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned to face us. His expression was blank, his mouth slightly open. I froze as his lips began to move, forming words that never came. There was no sound, just the slow, deliberate motion of his mouth. "Vickers?" I took a step toward him, but Daniels grabbed my arm, holding me back. "Don't," he said. His voice was tight, filled with something I couldn't place. Fear, maybe, or resignation. Vickers's mouth stopped moving. He stood there, perfectly still, his eyes staring past us into nothing. Then his head tilted back, and his arms fell limp at his sides. His body trembled, a faint shiver that spread from his shoulders down to his legs. And then, just like the figure we'd seen earlier, he collapsed. It wasn't like someone falling unconscious. It was like something breaking apart. His body didn't crumple. It disintegrated, collapsing into a pile of ash that scattered in the faint breeze. His gear clattered to the ground, untouched by whatever force had consumed him. I couldn't move. None of us could. We just stared at the spot where Vickers had been, the ash swirling in slow, lazy spirals before settling on the dirt. It wasn't possible. It didn't make sense. But it was real. "Keep moving," Daniel said finally, his voice hollow. He didn't look at the ash, didn't acknowledge what had happened. He just turned and started walking. For a moment, none of us followed. Morales was gone. Vickers was gone. And yet, the mission continued. The rules were all we had now, but they felt less like protection and more like a cruel game we couldn't win. We marched in silence, the weight of what we'd seen pressing down on us. Every step felt heavier, every shadow more menacing. The fog thickened again, swallowing the trees ahead and behind us, until it felt like we were walking through an endless void. That's when we saw the outpost. It appeared suddenly, looming out of the fog like a ghost. The structure was old, weathered by time and decay, its walls covered in dark, twisting vines. A faint light flickered in one of the windows, but there was no sign of life. Daniels hesitated, his hand raised to stop us. "We secure it," he said after a long pause. "Stay close, follow the rules." No one argued. We approached cautiously, weapons drawn, our flashlights cutting through the murk. The door hung crooked on its hinges, creaking softly as Daniels pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, carrying the faint scent of something rotting. The outpost was empty, or at least it looked empty. There were signs of the missing recon unit, gear scattered across the floor, maps pinned to the walls, a few bloodstains that had long since dried. But no bodies. In the corner of the main room, a pile of charred paper caught my eye. I crouched down, picking through the ashes until I found a piece that hadn't burned completely. It was part of a map, but the lines didn't make sense. They twisted and spiraled, forming shapes that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. "Burn it," Daniel said, his voice sharp. I hesitated. The map felt wrong, like it was watching me. But I didn't want to hold it any longer. I pulled out my lighter and held the flame to the paper. It caught quickly, the edges curling and blackening as the map dissolved into smoke. "Good," Daniels muttered. "We stick to the rules, no exceptions." I nodded, but the unease in my gut didn't go away. The rules hadn't saved Vickers. They hadn't saved Morales, and something told me they weren't going to save the rest of us either. We stayed in the outpost longer than we should have. The walls felt like a flimsy barrier against the forest's malice, but it was the only place that offered even the illusion of safety. Daniels barricaded the door with what little furniture was left, though the silence outside told us nothing would come crashing through. Whatever was hunting us didn't need to break in. Mills sat by the window, staring into the fog. His rifle rested on his lap, but his grip was slack, his fingers twitching absently. His lips moved soundlessly, mouthing words that didn't reach his throat. I didn't ask what he was saying. I didn't want to know. Daniels paced in the corner, his flashlight flicking off and on as he checked the dwindling supply of batteries. I could see it in his movements. He was unraveling just like the rest of us. The rules were supposed to keep us alive, but they were useless against the crushing weight of the dead zone. And me? I sat in the center of the room, clutching my rifle like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. Every shadow, every creak of the old building felt like a prelude to something worse. My thoughts drifted to the rules, replaying them over and over, searching for something we might have missed. Stay together, don't look at the lights, burn the maps. But they felt hollow now, like a joke we didn't understand. It was Mills who broke the silence. "They're watching," he whispered, his voice hoarse. His eyes were still fixed on the window. "I can feel them out there. They're waiting for us to leave." Daniel stopped pacing, his flashlight snapping off. "What did you see?" Mills shook his head, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Not see, feel. It's like they're pressing against the glass, waiting for us to make a mistake." Daniels moved to the window, pulling Mills back roughly. He peered into the fog, his expression hard, but his eyes betrayed him. He didn't see anything either. "We don't have a choice. We need to move." No, Mills said, his voice rising. We can't. Not now. Not yet. Daniels grabbed his shoulder. We don't have time for this. You know the rules. Stay together. Keep moving. If we stop, we're dead. Mills didn't respond. He just turned back to the window, his body stiff, his breathing shallow. I wanted to say something, to remind him that the rules were all we had left, but the words wouldn't come. A part of me agreed with him. Staying felt wrong, but so did leaving. Every choice led to the same place. We left an hour later. The fog outside had thickened, swirling in strange patterns that made it impossible to tell where the ground ended and the sky began. The forest loomed around us, silent as ever, but the weight of it had grown. It was suffocating, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. Daniels led the way, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the haze. Mills followed reluctantly, his shoulders hunched and his head low. I brought up the rear, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. I didn't expect to see anything. I wasn't sure I wanted to, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, something patient. We didn't make it far before the whispers started. They came from everywhere and nowhere, faint and indistinct, like a breeze moving through the trees. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the look on Mill's face told me he heard it too. Daniel stopped abruptly, his hand raised for silence. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They didn't form words, not exactly, but they carried meaning. Regret, fear, despair. They pulled at something deep inside me, dredging up memories I thought I'd buried, faces I hadn't seen in years, voices I'd tried to forget. Keep moving, Daniel said through clenched teeth. His voice sounded wrong, strained, like he was fighting something. Don't listen. We tried. God help us, we tried. But the whispers didn't stop. They burrowed into my mind, growing clearer with every step. My sister's voice was the loudest, calling my name, pleading for me to turn back. Alex, she whispered, you can't leave me here. I clenched my fists, biting down hard enough to taste blood. It wasn't her. It couldn't be. She'd been gone for years. But the whispers knew her name. They knew mine. We made it to a break in the trees, where the fog parted just enough to reveal the path ahead. At least, I thought it was a path. The ground seemed to shift underfoot, the shadows stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. The whispers faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt worse. Daniels raised his hand, signaling us to stop. He scanned the area with his flashlight, his jaw tight. This isn't right, he muttered. We're going in circles. No, Mills said, his voice trembling. They're leading us. They want us to follow. I turned to him, my heart sinking. Who? He didn't answer. He just pointed into the fog, his hand shaking. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a faint glow, like the lights we'd seen before. But this wasn't the same. It was colder, darker, pulsing like a heartbeat. Daniels cursed under his breath. We're not stopping. Move. We pushed forward, but the glow didn't fade. It stayed just out of reach, flickering like a dying star. The forest felt tighter now, the trees closing in, their branches scraping against my gear. Every step felt heavier, the ground soft and unsteady beneath my boots. Mills was the first to fall. One moment he was walking just ahead of me, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands. The next, he stopped abruptly, his body rigid. I barely had time to react before his knees buckled, and he crumpled to the ground. Mills! I dropped to my knees, shaking him. His eyes were open, but they didn't see me. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words I couldn't hear. "Leave him," Daniels said, his voice cold. "He's gone." I shook my head, my throat tight. "We can't." "He broke," Daniels interrupted, pulling me to my feet. "And if we stay here, we'll break too. Move." I didn't want to. God, I didn't want to. But something in Daniel's face told me he was right. Mills wasn't dead. Not exactly. But he wasn't coming back either. We left him behind, his body fading into the fog as we pushed forward. I didn't look back. The silence didn't last. It never did in the dead zone. It hung heavy over us for minutes, maybe hours, before the sound began. Faint at first, so soft. I wasn't sure if it was real or just my own mind fraying at the edges. A melody carried by a wind that shouldn't exist. It grew louder as we moved, threading its way through the fog, each note deliberate, childlike, and wrong. A nursery rhyme, sweet on the surface, but twisted in its delivery the way something sweet rots when left too long. The voice was high-pitched, lilting and feminine like a child's. It echoed faintly, threading through the trees, bouncing off unseen walls. My pulse quickened as the words drifted closer. Daniels stopped abruptly, his flashlight swinging toward the sound. I froze, my grip tightening on my rifle, though I didn't know what I thought it could do. I glanced at Daniels. He was pale, his jaw clenched, but his hands shook. His lips moved silently, mouthing the words along with the rhyme. "Daniels," I whispered. He turned toward me, but it wasn't him anymore. Not really. His eyes were hollow, his face drawn tight, like the life was being drained from him with every word. Daniels dropped his rifle. The sound echoed unnaturally, reverberating in the silent forest long after it should have stopped. His flashlight followed, rolling into the fog. He didn't react. He just stared into the distance, his lips still moving. I stepped forward. "Daniels, snap out of it. We need to move." "Do you hear it?" he whispered, his voice brittle. "It's her, my daughter. I used to sing it to her before bed. She loved it." "Daniels, she's here," he interrupted, turning toward the trees. "I can hear her. She's waiting for me." I grabbed his arm. "It's not her. You know it's not her." His head tilted slightly, his hollow gaze fixed on mine. "What if you're wrong?" Before I could stop him, he wrenched his arm free and stepped into the fog. "Daniels!" I yelled, but he was already gone. The fog swallowed him whole, taking the flashlight beam and his shadow with it. I thought about running after him, but I knew it was useless. He was lost, just like Harrison, just like Vickers, just like Mills. The rhyme continued, faint and mocking, drifting through the trees. It was louder now, closer. My chest tightened, and my breathing grew shallow. The melody didn't stop. It wound itself around my mind, wrapping tighter and tighter until I could feel it pressing against my skull. I stumbled forward, desperate to keep moving. The rules, the damn rules, flashed through my mind, but they were meaningless now. Burn the maps. Don't look at the lights. Don't acknowledge the voices. They hadn't saved us. They'd only delayed the inevitable. The ground beneath me shifted, soft and uneven. My legs felt heavy, my movements sluggish, like the forest itself was pulling me down. The rhyme followed me, the voice twisting into something darker with each repetition. I tripped, falling hard onto my knees. My rifle skittered away, disappearing into the fog. I didn't bother reaching for it. What good was a weapon against this, against them? The fog parted ahead of me, revealing something I couldn't comprehend. A clearing, bathed in an unnatural light that pulsed like a heartbeat. In the center, a figure stood. No, not stood, hovered. Its limbs were long and spindly, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It was neither human nor animal, its features shifting and melting like wax. The rhyme came from it. The childlike voice poured out of its mouth, but the words didn't match the way its lips moved. They didn't move at all. I couldn't look away. My body refused to move, frozen in place by fear and some unseen force. The figure tilted its head toward me, its hollow eyes burning into mine. My vision blurred. The words twisted in my mind, unraveling my thoughts, pulling at my memories. Faces flashed before me. Harrison, Morales, Vickers, Mills, Daniels, my sister, my parents, people I'd loved, people I'd lost. And then, all at once, the rhyme stopped. The silence was deafening, crushing. It pressed against my chest, stealing the air from my lungs. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, each step bending the ground around it. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My body crumpled to the ground, my knees hitting the dirt as my strength drained away. My mind was unraveling, slipping into the void that stretched endlessly ahead of me. The last thing I saw was the figure reaching out. Its hand, or whatever it was, brushed against my forehead, cold as death. The rhyme began again, faint and distant, echoing through the fog as the darkness claimed me. They found the black box months later, buried beneath the ash of what remained of the outpost. There was no sign of the team, no bodies, no gear, just ash. The last recording on the black box was garbled, filled with static and distortion. But beneath it, faint and haunting, the nursery rhyme could still be heard.